The wind was a thief. It stole the warmth from Alara's threadbare shawl, the moisture from her lips, and the last vestiges of the girl she had been only a week ago. It howled across the vast, bleached plains of Wyoming, a desolate hymn for a desolate place. The wagon bucked and groaned, its wheels sinking into ruts that seemed as old as the mountains looming like bruised sentinels on the horizon. Beside her, her father's silence was a heavier weight than the cold. He had not looked at her, not truly, since they had left the green, forgiving hills of their old life in Ohio. He had bartered her, his only daughter, for a plot of land and a handful of coin that would, he claimed, save her mother and younger brothers from starvation. He called a marriage. Alara, at 16, knew it for what it was, a sale. The destination, when it finally appeared, was less a home and more a wound upon the land. A 2-story frame house, its paint scoured away by years of relentless wind, stood hunched against a backdrop of gray sky. A sprawling, dilapidated barn sagged to one side, and a web of corrals held a few shivering cattle. There was no garden, no sign of softness or color. It was a place built for endurance, not for living. As the wagon creaked to a halt, the front door opened. A man emerged, and Alara felt the air leave her lungs in a small, sharp gasp. He was tall and broad, his form carved from the same hard materials as the land itself. His face was a landscape of its own, weathered and creased, with a beard the color of dried winter grass. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, flat blue, like a frozen lake, and they held an emptiness so profound it seemed to pull the light from the air. This was Silas Blackwood, the widower, her husband. Her father clambered down, avoiding her gaze. "Blackwood," he said, his voice tight. Silas nodded, his eyes flicking to Alara for a brief, unreadable moment before returning to her father. "The papers are inside." Papers. The word hung in the air, clinical and cold. The deed to her life. Her father moved toward the house, but Silas held up a hand. "The children," he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. As if summoned, they began to spill from the house. 1, 2, then 4 more. A cascade of them, ranging from a boy who looked no older than 5 to a girl nearly Alara's own age. They were a wild, unkempt collection of limbs and eyes, all fixed on her with a uniform hostility. Their clothes were patched and grimy, their hair tangled. They looked like small, feral creatures defending their den. The eldest girl, her face a thunderous mask of resentment, stood slightly apart, her arms crossed tight against her chest. She had her father's pale eyes, but hers burned with a hot, angry fire. "This is Alara," her father announced to the cold air, the words sounding hollow and absurd. He did not introduce the children. He did not need to. They were not individuals. They were a singular, 6-headed entity of grief and suspicion. He went inside with Silas. Alara remained on the wagon seat, her hands clenched in her lap until her knuckles were white. She felt the children's stares like physical blows. They were judging her, hating her. They saw a usurper, a replacement for the mother whose absence was a palpable presence, a ghost that haunted the very dust motes dancing in the thin sunlight. She could feel it, the shape of their loss. It was in the uncombed hair of the little ones, the defiant set of the eldest girl's jaw, the silent, gaping hole at the center of their world. After an eternity that lasted perhaps 5 minutes, her father returned. He carried a small, heavy pouch. He would not meet her eyes. "He's a good man, Alara. A hard worker. You'll have a roof over your head. It's more than I could give you." The justification was a weak, crumbling thing. He reached for her small trunk at the back of the wagon. "No." Silas's voice cut through the wind. He strode from the house and lifted the trunk himself, his movements economical and strong. He sat on the porch with a soft thud, the sound of finality. Her father faltered, then simply climbed back onto the wagon seat. He gathered the reins, his movements clumsy. For a single, shattering moment, his composure broke. His gaze met hers, and in his eyes she saw not cruelty, but a terrible, pathetic shame. Then it was gone. He slapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, turning in a wide, slow arc. Alara stood frozen on the ground, watching it shrink into the vast emptiness, taking the last piece of her old world with it. The sound of the wheels faded until there was only the mournful cry of the wind. She was alone, utterly, terrifyingly alone, with a silent man and his 6 hostile children on the edge of the known world. The house needs seeing to, Silas said, not to her, but to the space she occupied. He gestured toward the door and then turned, his long strides carrying him toward the barn without a backward glance. He had not welcomed her. He had not threatened her. He had simply stated a fact, as if she were a new piece of farm equipment, expected to perform a function. Summoning a strength she did not know she possessed, Alara walked up the 3 worn steps and pushed open the door. The cold outside was clean. The air that met her inside was thick and stale, heavy with the scent of unwashed bodies, burnt food, and something else, the cloying sweetness of decay, of sorrow left to fester. The main room was a disaster. Plates crusted with old food sat on a rough-hewn table. Blankets were piled in corners. A fine layer of dust coated every surface, a shroud over what might have once been a home. The children had followed her in, their silence more unnerving than shouts would have been. The eldest girl, Martha, stepped forward. "My mother kept a clean house." The words were stones thrown at Alara's head. Alara's throat was tight, her heart a frantic bird against her ribs. She looked at the girl, at the raw pain masquerading as anger in her eyes. She wanted to scream, to run, to dissolve into nothing. But the wagon was gone. There was nowhere to run. She was a virgin, a girl of 16, given to this broken man and his broken family. A tremor ran through her, a wave of pure, unadulterated fear. Her future was this room, this dust, these accusing eyes. She looked from the grime on the floor to the hostile faces before her, and a cold, hard knot of despair settled in her stomach. This was not a home. It was a grave she was expected to tend. That first night, she was shown to a small room at the back of the house, little more than a closet with a narrow cot. The air was frigid, the single window rattling in its frame as the wind clawed at the walls. Through the thin floorboards, she could hear the muffled sounds of the family below. A child's cough, the scrape of a chair, the low, infrequent rumble of Silas's voice. There were sounds of a life she was outside of, a circle she had no way to enter. She did not undress. She lay on top of the thin, musty blanket, still in her traveling dress, and listened to the house breathe its grief around her. Sleep was a distant country she could not reach. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind, was a reminder of her absolute isolation. She thought of her mother, of the scent of baking bread in their small Ohio kitchen. The memory was so sharp, so painful. It was like a physical blow. Tears she had refused to shed in front of her father or the children now slid, hot and silent, from the corners of her eyes, freezing on her temples. She was property, a bargain struck, and as the moonless, starless night pressed in on the tiny window, she understood that no one was coming to save her. She would either be consumed by this place, or she would learn to survive it. The dawn came not with light, but with a lessening of the dark. A pale, gray wash seeped through the window, revealing the stark reality of her new life. Alara rose from the cot, her body stiff and cold. The fear of the night had not vanished, but it solidified into a cold, heavy stone in her gut. It was a choice, she realized. Lie here and waste away, or move. She chose to move. Downstairs, the house was silent. The children were still asleep. A faint glow came from the cast-iron stove, indicating Silas was already long gone, out in the pre-dawn chill to tend to his duties. The main room was as she had left it, a monument to neglect. Her first instinct was to retreat, to hide in her cold room until summoned. But the image of her father's shame-filled eyes, the finality of the wagon disappearing over the rise, it fueled a different impulse. A spark of defiance. They expected her to be a child, to be cowed and useless. She would not be. She began with the hearth. She found the wood box nearly empty and, after a moment's hesitation, pulled her shawl tight and stepped out into the biting morning air. A neat stack of chopped wood sat against the side of the house. She gathered an armful, her muscles protesting the unaccustomed weight, and carried it inside. She coaxed the embers in the stove back to life, feeding the fire until a steady, welcome warmth began to push back against the room's chill. Next, the kitchen. It was a small alcove off the main room, and it was a battlefield of filth. Greasy pots were piled in a dry sink. The floor was sticky. With a grin set to her jaw, Elara looked for soap, for rags, for a bucket. She found a sliver of harsh lye soap and a pail near the back door. The pump outside was stiff and groaned in protest, but she worked the handle with both hands until a stream of icy water gushed out. She hauled bucket after bucket inside, heating the water on the stove. For hours, she worked in a silent fury. She scrubbed the pots until the iron shone black and clean. She washed every dish, every fork, every cup. She scrubbed the tabletop, her arms aching, scraping away layers of dried food. She swept the floor, raising a cloud of dust that made her cough, then got on her hands and knees and scrubbed it with hot, soapy water. It was mindless, grueling work, and it was a balm. With every stroke of the rag, with every bucket of dirty water she tossed out the door, she felt as if she were cleansing not just the house, but a small part of her own terror. She was not thinking about her future, about the silent man or his angry children. She was focused on the single, achievable task in front of her. Around mid-morning, the children began to stir. They emerged one by one, their eyes wide as they took in the scene. The fire crackled warmly. The main room, while still bare and worn, was clean. The kitchen gleamed. They stopped in the doorway, a silent, perplexed tribe. Martha was the last to appear. She surveyed the room, her expression unreadable. Then her gaze settled on Elara, who was wringing out a rag, her hands raw and red from the lye and cold water. "He'll expect dinner," Martha said. It was not an offer of help. It was a challenge. Elara simply nodded, her throat too dry to speak. She turned her attention to the pantry. It was poorly stocked, sacks of flour and cornmeal, a barrel of potatoes, some salted pork, onions. It was the food of survival. She found a slab of pork and began slicing it, her hands clumsy with the large knife. She put potatoes on a boil. The smell of frying salt pork and onions began to fill the room, a scent so fundamentally domestic it felt like an intrusion. The younger children, drawn by the aroma, crept closer. A small boy with wide, brown eyes, the one who looked about 5, watched her from a safe distance. He clutched a crudely carved wooden horse. Elara didn't look at him directly, sensing that any attention would make him bolt. She simply continued her work, her movements becoming more measured. She made a thick gravy from the pork drippings and flour and mashed the boiled potatoes. It was simple, heavy food, but it was hot and nourishing. When she was done, she ladled the food onto the clean plates and set them on the scrub table. She did not call them to eat. She simply stepped back, her work done, and waited. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, the youngest boy, the one with the horse, hesitantly approached the table, climbed onto a chair, and began to eat with his fingers. One by one, the others followed, including a reluctant Martha. They ate in their customary silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was laced with confusion. Elara did not eat with them. She felt she had not yet earned a place at the table. She took a single boiled potato and ate it standing by the stove, her back to them. She could feel Martha's eyes on her. When they were finished, they left their plates on the table and scattered. Elara washed them without a word. That afternoon, she found the mending basket. It was overflowing with torn shirts, socks with gaping holes, a dress with a ripped seam. She sat in a chair by the fire, the weak afternoon light falling over her shoulder, and began to sew. Her mother had taught her to make her stitches small and neat. The repetitive motion of the needle, in and out of the rough fabric, was calming. She repaired a tear in the little boy's shirt. She darned a pair of socks for one of the older boys. She worked until her eyes ached and the light failed. Silas returned as dusk was settling, a shroud of cold air entering with him. He stopped just inside the door, his gaze sweeping the room. He took in the clean floor, the warm stove, the orderly table. His eyes lingered on the mending basket, now half empty, with a neat pile of repaired clothing beside it. He looked at Alara, who had risen from her chair, her needle still in her hand. He said nothing. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs. She expected a rebuke, a criticism. Instead, he walked to the stove, where she had left a plate of food for him, covered to keep it warm. He sat at the table alone and began to eat. He ate every last bite. When he was finished, he brought his plate to the sink, where she was now pumping water to wash up. He set it down, and for a second, his calloused, work-worn fingers brushed against hers. The touch was accidental, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through her, a spark of warmth in the cold. "The roof on the east side of the barn needs patching," he said, his voice low. "A storm's coming in a few days." It wasn't praise. It wasn't thanks. But it was information. It was a crack in the wall of silence, a tacit acknowledgement that she was now part of the brutal calculus of this place. She nodded, unable to find her voice. He gave a curt nod in return and disappeared up the stairs. Later, as she climbed to her own cold room, she noticed something outside her door. A thick, woolen blanket folded neatly on the floor. It was old and smelled faintly of wood smoke and cedar, but it was heavy and clean. She picked it up, her throat tightening. She looked down the dark, silent hallway toward the room she assumed was his. It was the first kindness she had been shown, a silent, unspoken message. She took the blanket into her room, wrapped it around herself, and for the first time in this house, she slept through the night. The cold was still there, but it no longer felt like it would shatter her. It was something to be endured, something to be fought, and she was beginning to learn how. The days that followed fell into a rhythm dictated by work and weather. Alara rose before the sun, Silas already gone, and began the long process of turning the house into a home. The children watched her, their silence a constant, judging presence. Martha, in particular, was a fortress of resentment. If Alara cleaned a room, Martha would walk through it and find a speck of dust she had missed. If Alara cooked a meal, Martha would pick at it, her expression disdainful. Alara learned to ignore her, to focus on the tasks at hand, pouring all her fear and loneliness into the scouring of pots and the kneading of bread. She was creating order in the only place she could. Her small acts of domesticity began to chip away at the edges of the children's hostility. She noticed that the second youngest, a girl of 7 named Clara, had a persistent, hacking cough. One afternoon, while the others were outside, Alara found a small tin of honey in the back of the pantry. She heated water with a squeeze of precious lemon she'd found wrapped in wax paper and a spoonful of honey, a remedy her mother had always used. She brought the steaming cup to Clara, who was huddled by the fire. The girl looked up at her, her eyes wide and suspicious. "It will help your throat," Alara said softly, her voice raspy from disuse. Clara hesitated, then took the cup in her small hands. She took a tentative sip. Her shoulders relaxed, almost imperceptibly, as the warmth spread through her. She drank the entire cup without a word, but when she handed it back to Alara, her gaze was no longer hostile. It was simply watchful. Silas remained a distant, formidable presence, but the silent exchanges continued. Each morning, a full bucket of fresh water would be waiting for her by the kitchen door, saving her the trip to the freezing pump. Each evening, she made sure a hot meal was waiting for him, no matter how late he returned from the fields or the barn. They rarely spoke more than a few necessary words about supplies or weather, but a language was developing between them, one built on action and anticipation. She started to notice things about him. The deep weariness etched around his eyes that was more than just lack of sleep. The way his hands, though rough and calloused, were surprisingly gentle when he checked a calf's leg or reset a loose fence post. One afternoon, seeking a moment of solitude, Alara walked past the barn and up a small, windswept hill. There, under the lonely watch of a gnarled juniper tree, were two graves. One was small, clearly that of a child. The other was marked with a simple wooden cross, the name Sarah carved into it. Sarah Blackwood, the first wife, the mother. Alara stood before the grave, the wind whipping her hair across her face. She felt no jealousy, no rivalry, only a profound and aching sadness. This woman had lived and died here. She had given birth to 6 children in that drafty house, had fought the same dust, had stared out at the same unforgiving horizon. Alara felt a strange, ghostly kinship with her. She reached out and brushed a dusting of snow from the name on the cross. She was not a replacement. She was an inheritor of this woman's life, her work, her sorrow. She whispered a quiet, "I'm sorry," to the wind, though for what, she wasn't sure. For her death, for Alara's presence, for the children's pain. When she turned to go back to the house, she saw Silas standing by the corner of the barn, watching her. He had been there the whole time. Their eyes met across the distance, and for the first time, she saw something other than emptiness in his gaze. It was a flicker of understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the ghost that lived between them. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod, then turned and went back to his work. The gesture was more meaningful than 1,000 words of comfort could ever have been. That evening, the little boy, Thomas, the one with the wooden horse, came down with a fever. He was flushed and crying, his small body trembling. Martha tried to soothe him, but her movements were clumsy, panicked. The other children hovered, their anxiety filling the room. Alara, seeing the fear escalate, stepped forward. "Let me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Martha looked ready to object, her pride warring with her fear. But then she looked at her brother's flushed face and stepped aside. Alara knelt by Thomas's cot, which they had moved near the fire. She soaked a rag in cool water and gently bathed his forehead. She spoke to him in a low, soothing murmur, telling him a nonsensical story about a brave little horse who crossed a river of stars. She stayed with him for hours, long after the other children had fallen asleep, changing the compresses, whispering to him, her presence a calm anchor in his feverish haze. Silas came in late, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He stopped dead when he saw her by his son's side, her head bent, her hand resting on Thomas's small chest. He watched her for a long time, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. He didn't approach. He didn't speak. He simply stood witness. By morning, Thomas's fever had broken. He was weak, but his eyes were clear. He was clutching the wooden horse in one hand, and, with the other, he reached out and weakly tugged on Alara's sleeve. She looked down at him, and he gave her a small, shy smile. It was the first smile she had received in this house. It was like the sun breaking through the clouds. The atmosphere in the house began to change. It was a subtle shift, like the slow turning of a season. The younger children no longer shied away from her. Clara would silently bring her wildflowers she'd found in a sheltered patch of land. Another boy, Samuel, started helping her bring in the wood without being asked. They had begun to accept her, not as a mother, but as a fixed point in their tumultuous world. Only Martha remained aloof, her silence now more watchful than hostile. One evening, as Alara was mending by the fire, Silas came and sat in the other chair. It was the first time he had sat with her when it wasn't for a meal. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a shared space. He was cleaning a piece of tack, his large hands moving with practiced skill. "The mare is about to foal," he said, his voice quiet. "The one with the white blaze." Alara looked up from her sewing. "Is that good?" He considered the question for a moment. "It's life," he said simply. He looked at her then, his gaze direct. "You're a hard worker, Alara." The simple praise landed in her chest with a surprising weight. It was an acknowledgement of all the silent, back-breaking hours. It was a statement of respect. "I only do what is needed," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "You do more," he said. He held up the piece of leather he was working on, showing her the intricate stitching. "My father taught me this. He said a man's worth is in the strength of his work, the things he builds and the things he mends, he looked around the clean, warm room, at the pile of neatly repaired clothes, at the sleeping children in their beds. His eyes came to rest on her face. It is the same for a woman. In that moment, she was no longer a girl he had bought. She was a person he saw, a partner in the endless, brutal work of survival. Her fear, once a roaring blaze, had diminished to a pilot light, replaced by a steady, growing flame of determination. This was her life. This was her home, and she would not let the wind, or the sorrow, or the silence tear it down. The sky had been a deceptive, brilliant blue for 2 days, a cruel trick of the high plains. But Silas had seen the signs. The way the cattle bunched together, the unnatural stillness in the air, the peculiar, haloed cast of the sun. He had announced it the night before, his voice flat with certainty. A blizzard. It will be on us by tomorrow afternoon. The words dropped into the quiet warmth of the house like stones into a pond. The next day, the work was frantic. Silas and the 2 oldest boys, Jacob and Daniel, worked from dawn, reinforcing the barn, securing the livestock, and hauling in every last piece of chopped wood. Inside, Alara directed the other children. She had them fill every bucket and pot with water from the pump. She inventoried the pantry, calculating their supplies. She baked all the remaining flour into dense, heavy loaves of bread. The house was a hive of desperate activity. Martha worked alongside her, their earlier animosity forgotten in the face of a common enemy. The girl's movements were efficient, her face grim with the knowledge of what these storms could do. It began not with snow, but with wind. A low moan at first. It quickly escalated into a high, vicious shriek that seemed to tear at the very foundations of the house. The sky turned a bruised, churning gray, and then the world outside the windows vanished into a solid, swirling wall of white. The temperature plummeted. Frost began to creep across the inside of the window panes. Silas and the boys stumbled in just as the full fury of the storm hit, their faces raw and red, their clothes caked with snow. The north wall of the barn, a section of the roof, is torn, Silas said, his voice strained as he pulled off his frozen gloves. The new foal. I had to move her and the mare into the tack room. The rest should be secure, but if we lose that wall, we lose the herd. The weight of his words settled over them. The herd was their livelihood. Losing it meant starvation. I have to go back out, he said, already turning. Jacob, stay here. No. Alara's voice cut through the room, sharp and clear. Everyone turned to look at her. She, who was always silent, had spoken with an authority that stunned them. You can't. Not in this. You'll be lost in 10 feet. You will die, and it will be for nothing. His pale eyes locked with hers. For a moment, she saw the wild desperation in them, the rancher's instinct to save his stock at any cost. But he also saw the unyielding logic in her face. She's right, Pa, Jacob said, his voice trembling slightly. You can't see a thing. Defeated, Silas slumped into a chair, running a hand over his face. The sound of the wind was monstrous, a physical pressure against the walls. A sudden, violent gust hit the house, and the entire structure groaned. One of the younger children began to cry. Then another. Fear, cold and sharp, began to fill the room. Alara moved. Martha, she commanded, her voice steady. Help me get more blankets. Samuel, put more wood on the fire. Keep it hot. Clara, you and Thomas, come here. She gathered the smallest children, wrapping them together in a thick quilt. She sat with them, holding them close, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. But she could not show it. They were looking to her, their small faces pale with terror. She began to hum, a low, tuneless song her mother used to sing. The hours crawled by. The storm did not relent. It was a living entity, clawing, screaming, trying to get in. The house grew colder as the wind found every crack and crevice. They huddled together around the stove, a small island of warmth in a sea of freezing chaos. Sometime in the deep of the night, there was a tremendous crash from the direction of the barn, followed by the splintering of wood. Silas shot to his feet, his face a mask of anguish. The wall, he whispered. He made for the door again, and this time, Alara stood up and physically blocked his path. Silas, no. She put her hands on his chest, her small frame braced against his. She could feel the frantic energy in him, the desperate need to act. We will deal with it in the morning. If there is a morning. Tonight, your children need you here. Alive. He looked down at her hands pressed against his heart. He looked at the huddle of his children, their eyes wide with fear, watching them. The fight went out of him. He let her guide him back to the fire, where he sank down, the picture of defeat. The storm raged for 2 days. They lived in the small circle of light and warmth from the stove, eating the bread Alara had baked, speaking in low voices. Alara became the center of their small universe. She organized their meager meals. She told the children stories. She kept the fire fed, her presence a constant, reassuring calm. Martha, her pride stripped away by the primal fear of the storm, followed her lead without question, her face showing a new, grudging respect. On the third morning, they awoke to silence. An eerie, profound silence. The wind had died. Alara went to the window and scraped away the thick frost. The world was remade. Everything was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The sun was rising, casting a brilliant, blinding glare off the snow. It's over, she breathed. Silas was the first one out the door, the rest of them close behind. The devastation was breathtaking. The north wall of the barn had been torn away, leaving a gaping hole. Snow had drifted deep inside, but as they drew closer, they saw that the inner stalls had held. The herd, huddled together for warmth, was alive. Battered and cold, but alive. A wave of collective relief washed over them. As Silas began to assess the damage, he stumbled, a sharp cry of pain escaping his lips. He had been favoring his leg since the first day of the storm, but had hidden the extent of the injury. Now, in the bright light, they could see that a piece of timber had struck him. His trousers were torn, and the wound beneath was swollen and an ugly purple. He tried to wave them off, but Alara and Jacob helped him back to the house, his arms slung over his son's shoulders. She made him sit by the fire and gently cut away the fabric of his trousers. The gash was deep, angry, and already showing signs of infection. The children watched, their faces pale. "Martha, boil water. Bring the cleanest rags you can find," Alara ordered. She found a small bottle of whiskey Silas kept for medicinal purposes. She looked at him, her gaze steady. "This will hurt." He just nodded, his jaw tight. She cleaned the wound, her touch surprisingly gentle but firm. He flinched, hissing through his teeth, but he did not pull away. His eyes were closed, his face a tight mask of pain. She worked methodically, her focus absolute. When she was done, she bandaged the leg tightly with clean strips of linen. She looked up to find him watching her, his expression unguarded for the first time. The emptiness in his eyes was gone, replaced by something deep and raw. Gratitude. Awe. Something more. "Alara," he said, his voice rough. He reached out and covered her hand, which was still resting on his knee, with his own. His hand was large and warm, and it completely engulfed hers. "Thank you." The simple words were freighted with meaning. It was thanks for the wound, for the children, for the house, for holding them all together when the world was trying to tear them apart. In the quiet of the aftermath, surrounded by the sleeping children and the warmth of the fire, the wall of silence between them finally crumbled into dust. Martha stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching them, her arms no longer crossed in defiance. She saw not an intruder and her father, but two people who had weathered a storm together. A partnership had been forged in the heart of the blizzard, a bond sealed not by vows or papers, but by shared survival. In the wake of the blizzard, a new quiet settled over the house. It was not the strained, heavy silence of before, but a comfortable stillness, the air of a shared and survived ordeal. The rhythm of their lives resumed, but its cadence had changed. When Alara moved through the rooms, she no longer felt the phantom weight of being an outsider. The house had claimed her, and she had claimed it. The children, once a hostile pack, now gravitated toward her. Clara would bring her small, frozen flowers she'd found peeking through the snow. Thomas would follow her as she did her chores, chattering about his wooden horse. Even the older boys, Jacob and Daniel, would speak to her directly now, asking her opinion on mending a harness or whether a sack of potatoes had gone soft. The most profound change was in Martha. One afternoon, as Alara was kneading dough, her arms dusted with flour, Martha came to stand beside her. She didn't speak for a long moment, simply watching Alara's hands work the dough. Then, she picked up a spare cloth and began wiping down the counter. "My mother used to add a little molasses to the bread in winter," she said, her voice soft, her eyes fixed on the tabletop. She said it gave it heart. It was an offering, a memory shared, not wielded as a weapon. Alara paused, her hands still in the dough. "Show me how much," she said gently. A tentative peace accord was signed over the flour and molasses, a recognition that honoring the past did not mean rejecting the present. Silas's leg healed slowly. He was forced to stay inside for the better part of a week, a frustration that was playing on his face. But the confinement changed him. He watched Alara manage his household and his children with a quiet, efficient grace. He saw her patience with Thomas's endless questions, her firmness with Samuel when he tried to shirk his chores, the way she and Martha now worked together in the kitchen, their movements synchronous. He was seeing the woman she had become, forged in the crucible of his broken home. One afternoon, while the younger children napped, Alara decided to tackle a task she had been putting off. In her small room, tucked away in a corner, was a wooden chest that had belonged to Sarah. She had not dared to open it. It felt like a violation, but now it felt necessary. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, neatly folded, were a few precious things: a wedding dress of yellowed lace, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a pair of tiny, knitted baby booties, and a small, tarnished silver locket. She picked up the locket, her fingers tracing the intricate floral pattern on its surface. She polished it carefully with a soft cloth until it shone. That evening, after the meal was done, she approached Martha, who was reading by the fire. Alara held out the locket in her palm. "I found this," she said quietly. "It was your mother's. I think she would want you to have it." Martha looked from the locket to Alara's face, her own filling with a rush of emotion she couldn't hide. Tears welled in her eyes as she took the small piece of silver. She fumbled with the clasp, and Alara reached out, her fingers brushing Martha's as she helped open it. Inside were two miniature portraits, a younger, smiling Silas, and a woman with kind eyes and the same determined jaw as her daughter. "Thank you," Martha whispered, the words thick with unshed tears. She clutched the locket to her chest, a tangible piece of the mother she missed so desperately. In that moment, Alara was no longer the usurper. She was the keeper of memories, the one who had given a piece of their mother back to them. Weeks later, when the snow had melted enough to make the roads passable, Silas announced they needed to go into the nearby town for supplies. The trip had a new significance. As Alara got ready, she chose a simple, dark blue dress she had mended, and for the first time, she took care with her appearance, braiding her hair neatly and pinching her cheeks for a bit of color. When she came downstairs, Silas was waiting. He looked at her, and a rare, small smile touched his lips. He was wearing a clean shirt, and his beard was trimmed. He looked less like a man weathered by grief and more like the man in the locket. The town was a small, gossipy place. As they moved from the general store to the feed merchant, Alara felt the familiar weight of stares and whispers. She was the child bride, the girl sold to the silent, grim rancher with his brood of half-wild children. She kept her eyes down, her shoulders hunched against the judgment. As they were loading the last of the supplies into the wagon, a woman named Mrs. Gable, the town's primary purveyor of gossip, approached them. Her face was pinched with a kind of predatory pity. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice syrupy sweet. She let her gaze drift over Alara, a dismissive, head-to-toe appraisal. "And the little wife. It must be so difficult for you, dear child, shackled to such a hard life, and all those children. A tragedy, really." The insult was clear, wrapped in a thin veneer of concern. Alara flinched, color rising in her cheeks. She expected Silas to ignore it, to turn and walk away as he always did. But he did not. He stopped loading a sack of flour and turned slowly to face Mrs. Gable. The air grew still. He was a formidable presence, and his silence had always been unnerving to the townspeople. But now, when he spoke, his voice was not a rumble of anger, but a quiet, clear statement of fact. He moved to Alara's side and placed a hand on the small of her back. It was a gesture of possession, but not of ownership. It was one of partnership, of alliance. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his pale eyes holding hers without blinking. "This is my wife, Alara. The woman who held my family together through the worst blizzard in a decade. The woman who runs my home with more grace and strength than any woman I have ever known. Her life is not a tragedy. She is the reason my life is not a tragedy." A collective, indrawn breath seemed to pass through the few onlookers. Mrs. Gable's jaw snapped shut, her face mottling with surprise and indignation. Silas did not wait for a response. He simply looked down at Alara, his expression soft. "Are you ready to go home?" he asked. Home. The word resonated deep inside her. She lifted her chin, meeting the stunned gazes of the townspeople, and for the first time, she did not flinch. She felt the warmth of his hand on her back, a solid, steady anchor. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I am." The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but the silence was a warm blanket. The sun was setting, painting the vast sky in hues of orange and rose. The landscape no longer seemed desolate to her, but beautiful in its stark, rugged honesty. It was a land that demanded strength, and it had given her strength in return. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat together by the fire. The house was filled with a sense of peace it had never known. The wind whispered around the eaves, no longer a threat, but a familiar song. Silas reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His grasp was firm, his palm rough against her skin. It was not the touch of a lover, not yet. It was the touch of a partner, a comrade, a friend. Alara looked from their joined hands to the dancing flames in the hearth. She thought of the terrified 16-year-old girl who had arrived on a wagon months ago, a piece of property traded for coin. That girl was gone. In her place was a woman who had faced down starvation, storms, and sorrow, and had built a home from the ashes of a broken family. She had been given to this man, a virgin bride to a widowed rancher. But what had happened was not the tragedy the world saw. She had not been broken. She had been forged. The future would be hard, she knew. The land was unforgiving. But looking at the man beside her, feeling the steady strength in his hand, she knew she would not face it alone. The house was no longer a prison. It was a sanctuary. It was home. And for the first time, she felt a quiet, resilient hope bloom in her chest, as hardy and tenacious as a wildflower in the snow.